Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere that requires a little courage, a lot of context, and possibly a moment of gratitude for everything you currently take for granted. Tonight we're talking about the dark reality of being a black woman in 1950s America. Not the version with the cheerful diners and poodle skirts and sock hops that every nostalgic TV special keeps trying to sell you. The real version. The one where survival was a daily negotiation, dignity was a radical act, and the audacity of simply existing while black and female was enough to get you fired, arrested, humiliated, or worse. Before we get into it, a genuine and heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and so does the channel, because suggestions like this one are exactly why this community keeps growing into something worth being part of. If you enjoy what we do here, please like and subscribe, but only if you actually mean it. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And if you're catching this on Spotify, welcome, the link is in the description. Now, dim those lights, put on a fan, pull your blanket up, and let's take a breath before we begin, because tonight's story deserves your full attention. Have you ever wondered what it felt like to work twice as hard as everyone around you and still be told you weren't good enough? What it was like to sit in a diner and be refused a cup of coffee, not because you couldn't pay, but because of the colour of your skin. How a woman dressed impeccably, educated brilliantly, and composed perfectly, still couldn't vote in certain states without someone trying to make her life very difficult. What it meant to raise children in a world that considered them less than, while also convincing those same children they were more than enough. How you smiled at people who despised you, because your job, your safety, and your family depended on it. Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1953 America. You're a black woman. Your alarm goes off at 5 in the morning. The neighbourhood outside your window is yours, not by law, not exactly, but by the quiet, stubborn fact that you're here. And the day ahead of you is going to ask a great deal. It always does. There are two Americas in 1950. One is the one on television. Clean, bright, prosperous, full of smiling white families in station wagons heading toward the gleaming future. The other is the one you wake up in. Your alarm clock doesn't care about the difference. It goes off the same way every morning. Harsh, unpoetic, indifferent. You rise before the sun because you have to, because the world you're about to enter will begin judging you the moment you step into it, and you have learned, as every black woman of this era has learned, that the only thing standing between you and its worst impulses is your own meticulous preparation. The gap between these two Americas isn't just visible, it's physical. It lives in the address on your envelope, the side of town you occupy, the bus seat available to you, and the face that greets you, or doesn't, when you walk through a door. You dress in the dark sometimes, not because the electricity is out, but because getting up before the sun is simply the arithmetic of your life. Your shift starts at 7. The bus that serves your neighbourhood runs less frequently than the one that serves the white neighbourhood 2 miles east. You factor this in. You have always factored this in. This is what the other America does not have to do before 7 in the morning. It does not have to run the calculations. The two Americas have different grocery stores. Yours has older produce and higher prices, because the supermarket chains that are beginning to revolutionize food retail in this decade are not opening their bright, spacious locations in your neighborhood. You shop at the corner store owned by a man who knows your name, which is something, which is actually quite a lot, but you are also paying more per pound for the same chicken. You know this. You have always known this. You just don't have a choice that doesn't cost you time you don't have. The two Americas have different schools. You know what your children's school looks like because you've been inside it. The peeling walls, the textbooks donated after the white schools were done with them, the heating system that works on a flexible schedule. You know what the white, school on the other side of town looks like too because you've walked past it. It is not subtle, the difference. It is not something that requires careful analysis. It is visible from the street. And yet, here is the thing that the other America has never quite been able to account for. The thing that keeps not fitting into its tidy narrative about who has earned what. You are magnificent. Not despite all of this. Not in some tragic, persevering through adversity way that requires the outside world's pity to complete its meaning. Just straightforwardly, factually, magnificently capable. You run a household with the precision of an operations manager. You navigate social systems of bewildering complexity with the fluency of a diplomat. You read your children bedtime stories after a 12-hour day in someone else's house and make it feel like the most natural thing in the world. Because for you it is. The two Americas will keep pretending for a while longer that the division between them is natural, that it reflects something true about merit, about culture, about who built what. You know this is a lie. You have always known. You live on the evidence of the lie every single day. The alarm goes off. You get up. You prepare yourself with the care of someone who understands exactly what the day will ask of her. And then you walk out into an America that is, whether it likes it or not, partly yours too. It built itself on your labour. The least it can do is learn your name. Navigating daily life in 1950s, America required a kind of mental cartography that white Americans simply never had to develop. Every city, every town, every rural crossroads had its invisible lines, and they weren't invisible to you. You knew which side of the street belonged to whom, which water fountain was yours, which entrance to the department store you were expected to use, and which neighbourhoods you could pass through quickly versus which ones you could not linger in after dark under any circumstances. This wasn't paranoia. It was practical geography. Black women of this era carried a map of the country in their heads that had nothing to do with highways and everything to do with survival. The Green Book helped. Victor Hugo Green's annual publication, formerly titled The Negro Motorist Green Book, listed the hotels, restaurants, barbershops, and gas stations across the country that would actually serve you. Not the ones that might. Not the ones where it depended on who was working that day and what mood they were in. The ones that would. You planned road trips around it the way someone else might plan around toll roads. You identified your overnight stops weeks in advance. You memorized the gaps, the long stretches of highway, particularly through the rural south, where there was nothing in the book for 50 or 100 miles, where you packed enough food and enough gas and enough prayers to get you through. In cities, the lines were sometimes legal and sometimes simply understood. Southern cities posted their segregation explicitly. Separate waiting rooms at the bus station, separate windows at the courthouse, signs above water fountains that communicated the full philosophy of the era in 2 or 3 words. Northern cities were subtler about it, which didn't make them better, only harder to argue with. There were no signs above the water fountains in Chicago, but there were neighbourhoods where the real estate agent would not show you a house. There were restaurants where you would be seated near the kitchen and served slowly and made to feel the precise weight of your presence as an inconvenience. Department stores presented their own particular geography. You could shop in many of them, technically. You could walk through the door and purchase items. What you often could not do was try on clothing before buying it, because the dressing rooms were for white customers, and the logic, stated without embarrassment by store management, was that white customers would not want to wear something a black woman had touched. You bought clothes you hadn't tried on and hoped they fit, and if they didn't, you altered them yourself because returning them was its own negotiation. Restaurants, lunch counters, soda fountains. These were the front lines of daily humiliation, the places where the geography of segregation became most visceral and most personal because food is intimate and refusal is a statement. Being told you cannot sit at a Counter and eat a sandwich is being told in the plainest possible language that your hunger does not matter, that your comfort is not a consideration, that you are present but not real, visible but not seen. You learned to eat before you left home. You learned to pack food. You learned to need nothing from people who had decided you deserved nothing. It was an extraordinary education in self-sufficiency, and it cost you things that should never have been asked. The geography was not only spatial, it was temporal. There were times of day when certain spaces were not safe, not advisable, not worth the cost of the interaction you would have to survive. You internalized the map until it became automatic, until you stopped thinking of it as a map at all, and simply thought of it as how the world is, which is perhaps the most insidious thing segregation did. It tried to make its own cruelty feel like weather. There was an art to getting dressed as a black woman in 1950, and it had very little to do with fashion and everything to do with strategy. You dressed impeccably not because you were vain, though you were allowed to be, but because the world was looking for a reason to diminish you, and you were not going to give it one. A wrinkle in your blouse could become a comment about your character. A hair out of place could become a judgment about your professionalism. You pressed and pinned and polished yourself into a presentation that no reasonable person could fault, and then you walked out the door knowing that reasonable had never been the standard applied to you anyway. This is the paradox you lived in every morning in front of the mirror. No matter how perfectly you presented yourself, the world reserved the right to see what it had already decided to see. But you dressed impeccably regardless, because presentation was one of the few variables in your day that you actually controlled, and you were not the kind of woman who surrendered control of anything she didn't have to. The ironing board was out before sunrise. The clothes you wore to work in someone else's home were pressed. The clothes you wore to church on Sunday were pressed. The clothes you wore to the doctor's office, to the school meeting, to the grocery store, all pressed, all considered, all deliberate. Because you understood at a level so deep it had stopped being conscious thought, that the black woman who walked into a room impeccably dressed was harder to dismiss, harder to humiliate, harder to reduce to a type. Not impossible. Nothing was impossible for a determined racist with institutional backing, but harder. Your hair was its own project, its own conversation, its own political statement that you had not necessarily asked to make. The 1950s beauty standard was explicit and relentless. Straight hair was professional hair. Anything that grew naturally from your head in its natural state was, by the terms of the dominant culture, a problem to be solved. Hot combs, chemical relaxers, which were becoming more widely available in this decade, and which burned if you left them on too long, and which you left on too long sometimes because you needed the result, and the result required a particular kind of suffering to produce. You did this and called it maintenance, because maintenance was the word that made it manageable, and then you wore it to work, to church, to the store, into every room where someone would look at you and assess whether you met the standard. Sometimes you wore it, and someone white would reach out and touch it without asking, because your body had not yet been granted the status of a body that required permission to touch. You would smile. You had perfected the smile, the one that conveyed neither welcome nor hostility, the one that communicated absolutely nothing that could be used against you. You had been practicing it since childhood. The clothes cost money you measured carefully. The shoes were polished. The gloves, when you wore them, were clean. The whole presentation was, when you step back and look at it clearly, a kind of daily armour, not the kind that protects you from physical harm, but the kind that protects you from the worst of what the world wants to tell you about yourself. You put it on every morning. You wore it all day. And you came home in the evening and hung it up carefully for tomorrow, because tomorrow would ask the same things of you, and you intended to be ready for a vast number of black women in 1950s America. The workday began in someone else's home. Domestic service was not just the most available employment, For many women in the South and in major northern cities, it was the expected employment, the path that had been quietly cleared for you while other doors remained firmly closed. You cooked meals you couldn't afford to eat yourself. You raised children who would grow up to treat people like you as background characters in their lives. You cleaned houses that were larger than your entire block. And you did all of this for wages that required careful math at the end of every week just to cover the basics. Let's talk about what the math actually looked like. In 1950, a black domestic worker in the South might earn between $3 and $7 a week. In northern cities, the wages were somewhat higher, perhaps $15 to $20, but the cost of living was higher too, and the distance between what you earned and what you needed remained consistent in its cruelty. You did not receive overtime. You did not receive sick days. You did not receive the social security benefits that were just becoming meaningful to other workers, because domestic service had been specifically excluded from the original Social Security Act of 1935, a deliberate exclusion designed to protect the cheap labour supply available to Southern white households, and one that would take decades to fully correct. The work itself was total. You arrived in the morning, and the house told you everything that had happened since you left. Dishes in the sink, laundry in a heap, children who needed feeding and managing and driving to school activities in the family's car, which you drove but could not afford to own. The woman of the house might be present or might not be. If she was present, she was likely not helping. This was not her domain, in her understanding of the arrangement. You might have a cordial relationship with her, even a warm one. You might genuinely like each other in the way that is possible between people whose lives are structured around a profound inequality that neither of them created but both of them navigate every day. You learned the preferences of the household with the thoroughness of an anthropologist. How the father took his eggs, which child would eat vegetables if they were hidden in something else, and which one would not. Where the good silver was kept, and how it was expected to gleam. You held this knowledge quietly and competently, and when you did your job particularly well, which was most of the time, no one commented on it, because excellent work was the baseline expectation, and commentary was reserved for anything that fell short. You travelled to work by bus typically, which added an hour to your day on each end, hours that were not compensated. In the summer, the bus was hot and crowded, and you sat where you were permitted to sit. In the winter, you waited at stops with no shelter. You arrived, you did the work, you rode home. You did the same work at home that you'd just done somewhere else, for free, for your own family, with what remained of you after the day had taken its portion. And yet there was something else happening inside this labour that the math doesn't capture. You were watching. You were studying the architecture of another world, how it organised itself, what it valued, how wealth moved and accumulated and spent itself. You filed this information away with the same diligence you brought to everything else. You were not just a worker in someone else's house. You were a person, accumulating knowledge, raising children, building community, and waiting, with extraordinary patience, for a world that had more room in it than this one. People sometimes speak about Jim Crow as though it were a set of laws that lived neatly in courthouse filing cabinets and only came out on special occasions. In reality, Jim Crow was ambient. It was the air quality of the American South, and a significant portion of the North, something you breathed in constantly, that pressed on you from every direction, that shaped the geometry of your entire day. As a black woman, you encountered it not in dramatic confrontations, but in the 1,000 small humiliations that were designed to be too subtle to protest and too consistent to ignore. The cashier who didn't look up, the doctor's waiting room with 2 entrances, the library that technically served you but made the process of serving you feel like a burden. Jim Crow had moods. Some days it was almost quiet. You moved through your errands and your work and your errands again, and the friction was low enough that you could almost pretend, that the system wasn't there. And then some days it announced itself plainly. The bus driver who made you re-enter through the back door even though you'd boarded at the front and paid your fare. The salesperson who helped 3 white customers who arrived after you before acknowledging your existence. The police officer who found your presence in a particular neighbourhood a question worth investigating. On those days there was no pretending. There was only the decision about how to respond, which was its own exhausting calculation. The legal architecture of Jim Crow in the South was comprehensive in ways that a list cannot fully convey. Separate schools, separate hospitals, separate prisons, which were themselves a form of forced labour barely distinguishable from the system that had formally ended in 1865. Separate entrances, separate seating, separate everything, including, in some jurisdictions, separate Bibles in courtrooms, so that a black witness's hand would not touch the same Bible a white witness's hand had touched. If you think that sounds like something a person could simply decide not to be wounded by, through sufficient detachment or humour or spiritual discipline, you're underestimating the cumulative weight of a system that worked this hard to communicate your unworthiness every hour of every day. In the North, Jim Crow wore different clothes but carried the same luggage. Housing discrimination kept black families out of the neighbourhoods where good schools and appreciating property values lived. Employment discrimination kept them out of the jobs where advancement and pensions and workplace dignity lived. Social discrimination kept them out of the restaurants and clubs and social institutions where the connections were made that opened the doors to everything else. It was a system without signs, which made it harder to photograph for a newspaper and harder to explain to people who had decided they wanted not to understand it. What Jim Crow required of you, specifically, as a black woman moving through it, was an ongoing performance of composure. You could not afford most of the time to show what it cost you. Anger was dangerous. Grief was private. The face you wore in white spaces was calibrated to produce the minimum possible friction, because friction could escalate in ways that were never going to end well for you and might end in ways that were genuinely terrifying. So you composed yourself. You performed equilibrium you did not feel. You came home and set it down, if you were lucky enough to have a home where you could set it down, and then you picked it up again in the morning. Jim Crow clocked in when you did. It rode the bus with you. It sat in the waiting room. It watched you work. It never, ever took a day off. If there was one institution that held the architecture of black women's lives together in 1950 America, it was the church. Not just spiritually, though that mattered enormously, but logistically, socially, politically, and emotionally. The church was the community centre, the credit union, the news network, the therapy office, the organising hub, and the one place where a black woman's dignity was not under negotiation. She could be a deacon, a choir director, a Sunday school teacher, a pillar. The hierarchies that diminished her everywhere else did not disappear inside those walls. Gender still did its work. But the particular diminishment of race, that daily ambient contempt from the outside world, lost some of its grip the moment the doors closed. Sunday morning was a production. You understood this not as vanity but as ceremony, and you participated in it fully. Your hat was chosen with care. Your gloves were pressed. Your children were scrubbed and dressed in clothes that had been set out the night before to minimise the morning chaos. The whole family moved toward the church with the purposefulness of people going somewhere that mattered, because they were. The church was the one institution in American life that black communities owned outright, built, funded, staffed, and governed entirely by themselves, beholden to no white board of directors, no white landlord, no white employer who could threaten the lights. Going out. The pastor was a figure of extraordinary social power in this world. He was the link between the community and the political structures that governed it, sometimes literally, when civil rights organising began to move through church networks in the early part of the decade. But the women of the church were the infrastructure, the deaconesses, the mothers of the church, the women who ran the kitchen after service, who organised the benevolent societies that provided food and funds to families in crisis, who staffed the vacation Bible schools and the youth programmes and the choir rehearsals and the 100 other things that kept the institution functioning week to week. The church also operated as a financial safety net in a community that banks largely refused to serve. Informal lending circles, sometimes called susus, or rotating credit associations, allowed women to pool small weekly contributions and receive a lump sum in rotation. It was not glamorous. It was not the kind of capital accumulation that builds generational wealth in the way that mortgages and business loans do. But it was something. It was the difference between being able to buy your child a winter coat and not being able to. And in 1950, that difference was not small. The music is worth its own paragraph. Gospel music in the black church of the 1950s was not background. It was not ambient. It was a full-body, full-voice engagement with something that the weak had tried to take from you and that the music was giving back. When you sang in the choir, you were not performing for an audience. You were participating in a collective insistence that you were alive, that you mattered, that joy was available to you even inside a system designed to deny it. The harmonies the black church produced in this era were not incidental beauty. They were a theological and political statement, and you were part of making them. The church asked a great deal of you, as it always had. Your time, your money, your labour, your presence at every function, whether you were tired or not. In return, it gave you the one thing that 1950s America was most reluctant to offer: a room where you were completely, unambiguously somebody. One of the most quietly devastating responsibilities of black motherhood in 1950 was the conversation that every black parent dreaded having, and every black child eventually received. It wasn't one conversation exactly, it was an ongoing curriculum, delivered in pieces over years, calibrated to the age of the child and the particular dangers of the particular neighbourhood. It covered how to speak to police officers, how to move through white spaces, how not to be misread, how to be excellent without seeming to challenge anyone, how to survive an America that was not built for your survival, delivered with love, in a kitchen, while dinner was on the stove. You began early, not because you wanted to introduce your children to a world that wanted to hurt them before they were ready, but because ready in this context was not a luxury you could afford. A black boy of 7 in 1950 was already old enough to enter situations where the wrong move, the wrong word, the wrong look in the wrong direction could produce consequences that no amount of maternal love could reverse. You taught him early. You taught your daughters too, though their particular curriculum had its own chapters about what white men felt entitled to, about how to move through the world without being mistaken for an invitation. The surveillance was not only external. The black community kept its own eyes on its children, and this was protective and occasionally suffocating in the way that all close watching is. The neighbours knew your children's names, their schedules, their habits. If your son was somewhere he wasn't supposed to be, you heard about it before he got home. This was not an invasion of privacy. It was the community's immune system, a collective child rearing that understood the stakes and responded accordingly. School was a battleground of a particular kind. You attended meetings with teachers who did not always have high expectations for your children, and you made your expectations clear in the polite, immovable way you had perfected for dealing with institutional resistance. You reviewed the homework. You supplemented the curriculum with books you bought and borrowed and passed around the neighbourhood. You knew what your children's textbook said about American history. You had read them, and you told your children the fuller version at home, the one that included the people who looked like them and had built things and fought things and mattered. And through all of it, you tried to give your children something that the world was working hard to take from them, a secure sense of their own worth. Not arrogance, not the kind of confidence that would get them in trouble in the wrong room, but the deep, private, unassailable knowledge that they were loved, that they were capable, that the smallness the world wanted to assign them was a lie told by frightened people with institutional backing. You said it out loud when you could. You modelled it in the way you carried yourself. You baked it into their childhoods alongside everything practical and everything terrifying, hoping it would take root deep enough to hold when the world pushed back, as the world always did. You raised them for a future you could not fully see but were determined to make real. That is not a small thing. That is, in many ways, the whole thing. There is a category of labour that 1950s America assigned almost entirely to black women and then declined to recognise as labour at all. It wasn't domestic service with a paycheck and a bus schedule. It was the invisible maintenance of everything that kept a family, a community and a neighbourhood functioning, the cooking and cleaning and organising that was simply assumed, the emotional support that was simply expected, the social coordination that happened without acknowledgement or compensation. You kept the household's books when there was no budget for an accountant. You nursed the sick when there was no budget for a doctor. You mediated disputes, managed crises, and held things together with the quiet efficiency of a person who understood that no one was coming to help. Let's be precise about what a single day of this invisible labour actually contained. You woke before the family, you made breakfast, you got the children ready, you sent them to school, you went to work, actual paid work, in someone else's house or in a factory or in a schoolroom, and returned home to cook dinner, help with homework, manage whatever crisis the day had produced, and then, after the children were asleep, do the mending, the planning, the letter writing, the worrying. You did not call this work. There was no word for it that came with a check. The emotional labour was its own category of exhausting. You were the person people came to. Not sometimes, always. Your mother when she was struggling, your neighbour when her husband was drinking, the younger women on the block who needed someone to talk to, the children who were not yours but who needed something you had and were willing to give. You dispensed advice, comfort, practical assistance, and presence with the consistency of a municipal service, and no one budgeted for you, or thanked you, or asked if you had anything left. The community relied on this labour in ways that were structural, not incidental. Churches ran on it. Civic organisations ran on it. The political organising that would gradually build toward the civil rights movement of the later decade ran on it. The envelopes stuffed, the meetings arranged, the phone trees maintained, the logistics handled by women who showed up and did what needed doing without requiring their names on the programme. The broader American economy benefited from it too, in ways that economists would eventually begin to quantify. The unpaid labour of women maintaining households and raising children and caring for the elderly represented an enormous subsidy to the formal economy, work that would cost real money if it were contracted out, simply done for free because it was assigned to women by default and never reclassified. For black women, this invisible labour was compounded by the invisible labour of navigating racism, the time spent planning routes and managing interactions and preparing children for a hostile world. There was no compensation for any of it. There was barely acknowledgement. You did it anyway. Not because you were asked, not because you had decided it was your calling, but because you were the person who could see what needed doing, and the person who understood that if you didn't do it, it was unlikely to get done. This is a particular kind of competence, the competence of the person who runs the room without being given the title for running the room. It is common in this era among black women. It is not a coincidence. It is what happens when a community invests its trust in the people it has learned it can rely on. There is a particular kind of beauty culture that developed among black women in 1950s America, and it was not merely cosmetic, it was philosophical. The beauty salon was a sacred space, a weekly ritual, and a political act all at once. Getting your hair done was the social event, the therapy session, the news exchange, and the community meeting rolled into 2 hours on a Saturday afternoon. It was also, more pointedly, a refusal. In a culture that spent considerable energy telling black women that their natural features did not meet the standard of beauty, the standard being, of course, a white one. The rituals of adornment and presentation were a daily, deliberate insistence on one's own worth. The beauty salon had a particular atmosphere that you recognized the moment you walked in. The smell of pressing combs heating on the stove, the sound of conversation, real conversation, the kind that didn't have to be calibrated or policed, the kind where you could say the actual thing and not the version of the thing that was safe for white company. The women in the chairs were secretaries and teachers and domestic workers and church mothers, and the distinctions between them softened under the heat and the smell and the particular democracy of a place where everyone was there for the same reason, to be tended to. The economics of black beauty were themselves remarkable. Madam C.J. Walker had built her fortune on the understanding that black women needed products designed for black hair, and the industry she helped found had become, by the 1950s, a genuine engine of black economic life. Black-owned beauty supply companies, black beauty schools, black salons in every neighborhood that employed black women who were trained at black institutions, who built clientele in their communities and stayed. The money circulated. This was not an accident or a coincidence. It was the result of women who understood that economic self-sufficiency and community investment were not just financial strategies, but political ones. The pressure to conform to white beauty standards was constant and came from multiple directions at once. Advertising, employment, the casual commentary of the mainstream culture that evaluated black features against a standard those features were never going to meet. Billboards and magazine covers did not look like you. The beauty industry that served white women was enormous and lavishly funded. The industry that served you operated on the margins. And yet the women in those salons on Saturday afternoons were not defeated. They were spectacular. They wore their pressed hair and their rouge and their carefully chosen lipstick shades, deep reds and rich plums that suited dark skin in ways that the drugstore brands marketed to white women didn't bother to. And they walked out of the salon feeling exactly what the experience was designed to make them feel: seen, attended to, beautiful, present. Not because the white world had validated any of this. It hadn't. It was doing the opposite, loudly and consistently. But the white world's opinion had been weighed and found insufficient. You had your own mirrors, you had your own standards, you had 2 hours on a Saturday in a room full of women who saw you clearly and found you magnificent, and you were taking that home with you whether the rest of the world was ready or not. In theory, black women in 1950s America had the right to vote. The 19th Amendment had extended suffrage to women back in 1920, the 15th to black men in 1870. In theory. In practice, if you were a black woman living in the South, and a great many black women were, the gap between the theory and the reality was wide enough to swallow years of your life whole. Poll taxes required you to pay for the privilege of voting. Literacy tests asked you to interpret obscure legal passages to the satisfaction of a white registrar who had already decided you would fail. Registration offices had convenient hours, inconvenient locations, and staff who would look at you with a particular smile that communicated everything. The poll tax sounds simple enough when you describe it abstractly: a fee required before you could register to vote. In 1950, the tax in most southern states was between $1 and $2 per year, and in most states it was cumulative, meaning if you hadn't paid in previous years, you owed the accumulated total before you could register. For a domestic worker earning $7 a week, 2 years of unpaid poll taxes represented a significant percentage of monthly income. The tax was not designed to raise revenue. It was designed to price people out of democracy, and it did so with mathematical precision. The literacy tests were worse because they introduced human judgment into the equation, which is another way of saying they introduced human malice. You would be asked to read a passage from the state constitution and explain it to the registrar's satisfaction. The registrar would decide whether your explanation was satisfactory. There was no rubric. There was no appeals process. There was only a white man at a desk with the power to tell a woman with a college degree that she had failed to demonstrate adequate literacy, and no one who would do anything about it if he did. And if you made it past the poll tax and the literacy test, the social pressure began. In many counties, it was understood that black residents who attempted to register to vote could expect consequences. Your employer might receive a quiet call. Your landlord might suddenly find your lease problematic. The bank that held your farm's mortgage might find your credit risk elevated. These were not idle threats. They were the enforcement mechanisms of a system that understood its own vulnerability and was prepared to defend itself. In 1952, black voter registration in the Deep South sat at a fraction of the eligible black population, a fraction kept small not by apathy but by design. The women who attempted to register anyway were extraordinary in ways that history books have sometimes struggled to honour adequately. They went down to those offices knowing what they were walking into. They endured the tests, paid the taxes if they could, and documented the obstruction when they couldn't. They went back. Some of them went back year after year, refused each time, and went back again. This is not a small thing to do when refusal can cost you your job, your home, or your safety. This is in fact a form of courage that the word courage is barely large enough to contain. The Great Migration had promised something. It was never a fully articulated promise, never put in writing, but it was understood. Head north, and things will be different. Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, cities with factories and opportunity and a different kind of sky. Black families had been migrating northward since the early 20th century, and by 1950 the movement had reshaped the demographic map of America. But for black women who made the journey, the North turned out to be a different flavour of the same problem. The signs weren't posted, the laws weren't the same, but the apartment buildings had restrictive covenants, the unions had their own quiet policies, and the neighbourhoods had ways of making their feelings known that didn't require a sign on the door. You arrived at the train station with everything you owned in 2 bags and a cousin's address written on a folded piece of paper in your coat pocket. The station itself was a revelation. No coloured waiting room, no separate entrance, just the grand, indifferent noise of a northern city going about its business. You stood in it for a moment and felt something loosen in your chest. That loosening, it turned out, was premature. It was the North introducing itself before it showed you what it actually was. The apartment search came first. Your cousin had been in Chicago for 3 years, and she knew the geography, not the tourist geography, not the L train stops and the lakefront parks, but the real geography, the one that told you which landlords would rent to black families and which ones would not. The ones who would were concentrated in specific neighbourhoods: Bronzeville on the south side, Harlem in New York, Paradise Valley in Detroit, neighbourhoods that had been absorbing the Great Migration's arrivals for decades and were, by 1950, dense and vibrant and deeply overcrowded. The housing stock was old. The buildings were divided and subdivided. Landlords who knew you had nowhere else to go charged what they liked and maintained what they chose, which was often very little. The factory jobs that had drawn black families north during the war years were changing. The post-war economy was reorganizing itself, and the reorganization was not neutral. Seniority systems in unions rewarded the workers who had been there longest, which meant white workers who'd been admitted to unions when black workers had not. Automation was beginning to reshape manufacturing in ways that disproportionately eliminated the entry-level and semi-skilled positions that black workers had only recently been permitted to fill. The ladder that was supposed to be there when you arrived was shorter than advertised, and the rungs were slippery. The schools in northern cities were not legally segregated. They were, however, effectively segregated because the neighborhoods were segregated and the schools served the neighborhoods. The school your children attended in Chicago's South Side was not the same as the school they would have attended in the white neighborhood 3 miles north. The funding came from property taxes, and the property in your neighborhood, thanks to decades of deliberate underinvestment and restricted mortgage access, was worth less, which meant the tax base was smaller, which meant the school had less of everything. This was not an accident. It was a system producing exactly the results it was designed to produce, in a city where no one had posted a single sign about it. And yet, you stayed. You built something. The North's broken promise was still, in crucial ways, less suffocating than the South's explicit one. You could vote, or try to. You could walk through a front door. You could speak to a white person in a public space without the elaborate performance of deference the South demanded. These were not small things. They were not the freedom you had come for, but they were the room in which freedom might eventually be built, and you were the kind of woman who built things even in rooms that weren't yet ready for you. If you were a black woman in 1950s America and you needed medical care, the first question was not what is wrong with you, it was where are you allowed to be treated. Hospitals across the South were explicitly segregated. The wards designated for black patients received less funding, less staffing, and less equipment. The beds were older. The waiting times were longer. In many rural areas there were no black hospital wards at all, and the nearest facility willing to treat you was a matter of hours and miles. Black physicians existed, brave, brilliant people who had navigated a medical system that tried to exclude them at every step, but they were concentrated in cities, and their hospitals were perpetually underfunded. Let's start with childbirth, because childbirth is where this particular inequality announced itself most plainly and most dangerously. A black woman giving birth in the rural South in 1950 might do so at home, with a midwife, not because she preferred it that way, but because the hospital that might have received her was for white patients only, and the black ward in the next county was 40 miles away, on roads that were not maintained. Maternal mortality rates for black women in this era were roughly 4 times higher than for white women. 4 times. This was not a mystery with an unknown cause. It was a predictable outcome of a system that had decided, at the level of policy and practice, that black women's lives were worth less. The physicians who served black communities in the cities had often trained at one of a small number of black medical schools, Howard University in Washington, Meharry Medical College in Nashville, institutions that existed because the mainstream medical schools had closed their doors. These doctors were, in many cases, extraordinarily capable, trained under conditions of constraint that would have broken people with fewer reasons to persist. They set up practices in black neighborhoods. They extended credit to patients who couldn't pay. They made house calls because their patients couldn't always get to them. They worked themselves, in many cases, into early graves. The Hill-Burton Act of 1946 had provided federal funding for hospital construction across the country, with a provision, defended by Southern congressmen, that allowed hospitals to be built on a separate but equal basis. What this produced, in practice, was a wave of new and expanded hospital construction that formalized and federally funded racial segregation in healthcare. The separate was real. The equal was theoretical to the point of being insulting. Black wards received the equipment that white wards had finished with. The staffing ratios were worse. The physical spaces were smaller and less well maintained because the people using them had not been granted the status that would have made their comfort a priority. You navigated this system with the practical creativity you brought to every system that was not designed for you. You knew which white doctors in your town would treat black patients and under what conditions. You knew which pharmacist would fill a prescription without incident. You kept your children healthy with the vigilance of someone who understood that getting sick was expensive in ways that had nothing to do with money. Expensive in time, in risk, in the particular exhaustion of being a black patient in an American medical system that had not yet been compelled to treat you as fully human. You kept yourself healthy with the same vigilance, which meant you often didn't rest when you should have, didn't stop when you should have, didn't ask for help when you needed it. Because stopping had costs too, and you had run the math. There was an unwritten code of conduct that governed the daily interactions between black women and the white world they moved through, and it was learned early and practiced constantly. The code was simple in its structure and exhausting in its application. You were expected to signal in every interaction that you did not consider yourself an equal. Not through explicit statement. You would never say the words, but through posture, through tone, through the careful choreography of deference that white Southerners in particular had developed into an elaborate social language. You stepped aside on the sidewalk. You addressed white adults as sir and ma'am. You kept your eyes appropriately lowered at the right moments. You did not correct a white person in public, even when they were wrong. The rules were not written down, which was part of what made them so effective as a system of control. A written rule can be challenged. A written rule has edges you can find and push against. An unwritten rule is enforced by social consensus and by the threat of consequences that are never quite specified but always clearly implied. You learn the rules, the way all children learn the rules of the world they inhabit, by watching, by being corrected when you got it wrong, by absorbing the lessons embedded in how the adults around you moved through white spaces and came back from them and reported what had happened. White women occupied a particularly complicated position in this etiquette. They were, by the formal hierarchy of the South, above you. Their comfort and convenience ranked ahead of yours in every transaction. But they were also, by the formal hierarchy of gender, below their own husbands and fathers and the white men who ran the institutions that governed everyone's life. The relationship between black women and white women in domestic employment was intimate in a way that made the power differential, both constant and strange. You knew things about white women that their husbands didn't know. You saw them without their public face on. You raised their children with a care that sometimes exceeded what their mothers provided. And you did all of this while navigating a relationship in which any assertion of your own dignity could be read as insubordination. The etiquette extended into language in ways that were precise and deliberate. In the South, white people addressed black adults by their first names as a matter of routine, while expecting to be addressed as Mr. and Mrs. in return. To call a black adult by a title, to say Mrs. Johnson rather than simply Ruby, was to grant a form of social recognition that the system was not prepared to extend. Some white employers refused to do it. Others did it quietly, as a small private acknowledgement that the rules were absurd, though they did not say so out loud, because saying so would have had its own costs. What this etiquette required of you, on a cellular level, was a continuous splitting of yourself, the self that existed inside, that knew its own worth and nursed its own opinions and held its own counsel, and the self that was presented to the white world, which was composed and agreeable and carefully undemanding. This split was not unique to black women. It was a feature of life for anyone navigating a significant power differential, but the particular form it took in the Jim Crow South, the completeness of it, and the duration of it, the fact that it was required not just in high-stakes moments, but in every single interaction across the whole of a day, made it a form of psychic labour so constant that naming it as labour at all required a distance of decades and the words of scholars who came later. In the moment, you simply called it Tuesday. By 1950, a growing number of black women had moved into positions beyond domestic service: teachers, nurses, clerical workers, small business owners. The professional class was real, and it was significant, and its members worked with a ferocity born from the knowledge that failure would be attributed not just to them, but to their entire community. But even for the most credentialed, most accomplished, most impeccably presented black woman in America, the ceiling was low and opaque. It was not called a ceiling. No one posted a sign. It simply manifested as the white colleague who was promoted over you, the job that went to a less qualified applicant, the performance review that praised your work and then found a reason not to advance it. Teaching was the profession most available to educated black women in this era, and it attracted women of remarkable ability who might, in a different country, have gone into law or medicine or government. The black school was their domain, and within it they operated with a professional authority they were denied everywhere else. They were in many cases better educated than their white counterparts, having had to work harder for the same credential, having had to be better simply to be considered, and they brought to their classrooms an urgency that came from understanding exactly what was at stake for the children in front of them. Outside the protected space of black institutions, the professional world was a different landscape entirely. Black women who sought clerical work in white businesses in northern cities in the 1950s were navigating a set of barriers that were informal but effective. Many companies simply did not hire black women for front-facing positions. The stated reason, when a reason was given at all, was that white customers would be uncomfortable. This was stated as a market reality rather than a moral failure, which was the preferred framing. The market had decided. Nothing personal. The federal government was, oddly, one of the more accessible employers for black women with clerical skills in this era, particularly in Washington, where the civil service had nominally desegregated under President Truman in the late 1940s. The reality was uneven. Segregation persisted in many agencies and departments well into the decade. But the federal workforce represented a genuine opening, and black women moved into it with the focused determination of people who had been watching doors for a very long time and recognized one that was actually ajar. They became the backbone of the federal bureaucracy in ways that the bureaucracy did not particularly acknowledge or reward. The ceiling showed itself most clearly in the question of advancement. You could be hired sometimes. You could perform your job excellently, which you did, because the alternative, performing it merely adequately and giving the institution a reason to confirm its assumptions, was not available to you. And you could be passed over, year after year, for the promotions that your performance had earned, and when you asked about it you received explanations that were reasonable sounding and impossible to disprove, and that translated, when you stripped away the professional language, to, "We are not ready for you at this level." The ceiling was real. It simply had the courtesy not to announce itself, which meant you were always bumping your head against something nobody else could see, and being asked why you kept complaining about the headache. The neighbourhood you lived in was not an accident. It was a policy. Redlining, the practice by which the federal government and private banks designated black neighbourhoods as high-risk investment zones, systematically denying mortgages and loans to black families, was not fringe behaviour in 1950s America. It was official. Federal Housing Administration guidelines explicitly discouraged integration, and real estate agents, banks, and municipal governments enforced the boundaries with a thoroughness that would have been impressive if it weren't so destructive. For black women who were building families, the consequences were concrete and compounding. You could not buy into a neighbourhood where property values would appreciate. You could not build the equity that would fund your children's education or your own old age. The mechanics of redlining were, in hindsight, almost elegant in their cruelty. The Homeowners Loan Corporation had produced maps of city across America in the 1930s, colour-coding neighbourhoods by investment risk. Green meant safe, red meant hazardous. The criteria for hazardous included the presence of black residents, not their income, not their credit history, not the condition of the housing stock, but simply their presence. A neighbourhood that was black was, by definition, a bad investment. Banks used these maps to determine who received mortgages and who did not. Insurance companies used them to determine coverage. The maps shaped the physical development of American cities for decades, and their effects have not fully unwound even now. What this meant for you, practically, was that the path to home ownership, the central mechanism by which American families built wealth in the post-war decades, was blocked. The GI Bill, which helped millions of white veterans purchase homes in new suburban developments and attend college on the government's money, largely bypassed black veterans and their families. The suburban developments themselves were often explicitly closed to black buyers, enforced by deed restrictions that specified the racial identity of permitted occupants. The wealth-building boom of the 1950s post-war economy was one of the most significant in American history, and you were positioned outside it by deliberate policy, while being told that the gap between your outcomes and white outcomes reflected something about your choices or your character. The neighbourhoods you did live in were not without value or vitality. They were, in many cases, genuinely rich in culture, community and mutual support. Bronzeville and Harlem and Sweet Auburn in Atlanta were not wastelands. They were cities within cities, with their own newspapers and theatres and restaurants and political organisations and intellectual life. But they were also overcrowded, underserved by municipal infrastructure, and subject to the particular deterioration that comes from being inhabited by people who cannot get loans to maintain their properties. Landlords who knew their tenants had no alternative extracted maximum rent for minimum maintenance. The buildings aged. The streets stayed unpaved longer than the white streets. The parks received the equipment that was left over after the white parks had been equipped. You watched the suburbs being built from a distance, those clean, new, affordable developments, where a veteran and his wife could buy a house with a small down payment and a government-backed mortgage and begin the process of accumulating the equity that would become the foundation of their children's middle-class life. You watched it and understood, with a clarity that required no formal economics education, exactly what was being constructed and exactly what was being denied. The architecture of poverty was not a natural formation. It was built, deliberately and at federal expense, one red-lined map at a time. In the segregated South, black teachers occupied a peculiar and demanding position. They were among the most educated members of their communities, which gave them authority and respect within those communities. They were also employed by the state, which meant their livelihood depended on the goodwill of white superintendents and school boards who could dismiss them for any reason or no reason at all. Black schools were underfunded by design, receiving a fraction of the per-pupil spending allocated to white schools, which meant black teachers were expected to produce excellence from scarcity. Old textbooks, damaged buildings, overcrowded classrooms, insufficient supplies, and they did it. They produced excellence anyway because the children sitting in front of them were depending on it. Your classroom held perhaps 40 children, and the chairs were mismatched because there had never been a budget to purchase a complete set of anything. The textbooks had been used in white schools first. You could tell from the penciled names on the inside covers, the worn spines, the pages that were soft from years of other children's handling. The books described an America that did not include your students in any meaningful way, so you taught from the books and around the books simultaneously, supplementing and contextualizing with a running commentary that the curriculum did not provide. You taught children to read from materials that did not reflect their existence, which required a particular pedagogical creativity that was never acknowledged in your salary. The salary was, in the South, explicitly lower than the salary paid to white teachers with equivalent credentials and experience. This was not a secret or an oversight, it was policy, challenged in courts throughout the 1940s and 50s in cases that produced some victories and were resisted by school boards with creative determination. The pay gap was rationalized in various ways, all of them unconvincing to anyone who thought about them for more than 30 seconds. You taught anyway. You could not afford not to financially, and you could not bring yourself not to professionally, because the children in your classroom needed what you had and were not going to get it from anyone else. The relationship between black teachers and their communities was one of the closest in American life. You were not simply a professional who happened to work in the neighborhood. You were a member of it, woven into its social fabric in ways that the job description did not capture. You attended your students' churches. You knew their parents and their grandparents. When a child was struggling, you often knew why before the parents told you, because you were already aware of what was happening in that household. This proximity gave you an effectiveness that more resourced but less connected teachers could not replicate. You used it. Brown versus Board of Education was decided in 1954, and its implications for black teachers were complicated in ways that the jubilation of the moment did not immediately surface. Desegregation meant that black children would eventually have access to better-funded schools. It also meant that those schools would be staffed primarily by white teachers, and that the black teachers who had built their careers in segregated schools would find themselves redundant in a newly integrated system that did not particularly want them. Thousands of black teachers lost their jobs in the years following Brown, displaced not by incompetence, but by a desegregation process that valued the facilities of white schools while discarding the educators of black ones. The victory was real, and it cost something. It always did. It would be dishonest to write about black life in 1950s America without addressing directly the threat that lived underneath everything else. Not theoretical violence, not historical violence from a previous century. Present violence, the kind that happened to real people in real towns, and was often not investigated, rarely prosecuted, and frequently reported in the local newspaper, with a detachment that still makes for uncomfortable reading. For black women, the threat came in several forms. Sexual violence by white men had been a feature of black women's lives since enslavement, and in 1950 it had not disappeared. It had simply become unprosecutable in a new way. The vulnerability was structural. The legal system offered you, as a black woman in the South, a very particular and very limited form of protection. Courts that would convict a black man on the uncorroborated testimony of a white woman would require extraordinary evidence to convict a white man of anything involving a black woman. This was not an accidental asymmetry. It was the system operating as designed, reflecting the hierarchy it had been built to enforce. You knew this. Every black woman knew this. You factored it into decisions about where you went and when and with whom, the same way you factored in the bus schedule and the weather. It was a variable in the equation of your daily life, and you managed it with the same practical intelligence you brought to everything else. Emmett Till was murdered in 1955, and his mother, Mamie Till, made the decision to have an open casket funeral, to let the world see what had been done to her son. Jet magazine published the photographs. The images travelled. They landed in living rooms and church halls and beauty salons across black America and produced something that was beyond grief, a cold, clarifying fury that accelerated what was already beginning to build. Mamie Till's decision to let the world look was itself an act of extraordinary courage, performed by a black woman in a country that had already decided her son's life was not worth investigating, let alone avenging. His killers were acquitted by an all-white jury in 67 minutes. The violence was not only spectacular and headline-producing, it was also quiet and chronic. The threat in a landlord's voice when you were late on rent, the police officer who stopped you for no reason and made the stop last long enough to communicate the point, the white man on the street who said something and watched to see if you would react, hoping you would, because your reaction would give him permission for whatever came next. You did not react. You had been taught not to react. The self-discipline this required was enormous, and it was never acknowledged as the achievement it was because it was invisible, because it was the absence of a response rather than the presence of one. You carried this knowledge of the violence that was possible, of the violence that had happened to people you knew, not as paralyzing terror, but as calibrated awareness. It was in the background of your days, a frequency you had learned to hear without letting it drown out everything else. You lived your life. You went to work and church and the store and the beauty salon. You raised your children and attended community meetings and fell in love and grieved and celebrated and did the 1,000 ordinary things that constitute a life. You did all of this with the knowledge of the threat present, managed, held at a distance that was not always as large as you would have liked. This was not a small thing to sustain. It was in fact one of the most demanding things a human being can be asked to do. Rosa Parks is among the most famous names in American civil rights history, and she deserves every word of that recognition. But the story of why she became famous is inseparable from the story of the black women who had refused to give up their seats before her, women whose cases were considered, evaluated, and ultimately deemed insufficient to anchor a movement for reasons that reveal a great deal about how even the civil rights leadership thought about the optics of protest. Claudette Colvin was 15 years old when she refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus 9 months before Parks did. She was arrested and charged. The NAACP decided not to make her case the centre of their legal challenge. Colvin was young and dark-skinned, and she had become pregnant, and the men who ran the civil rights organizations of the 1950s, brilliant, courageous, deeply human men with the particular blind spots of their era, made a calculation about which body, which biography, which presentation of black womanhood would be most effective as the public face of a legal challenge. They were not wrong that these calculations mattered. They were making them inside a white supremacist system that evaluated the credibility of black women's suffering by criteria that had nothing to do with the suffering itself. But the calculation is worth sitting with, because it tells you something true about the position of black women even within the movements that were fighting for their liberation. Rosa Parks was not, as the sanitized legend sometimes suggests, simply a tired seamstress who one day refused to move because her feet hurt. She was a trained activist, a long-time NAACP secretary, a woman who had attended the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, and organizing an education center that trained civil rights activists, and who understood precisely what she was doing on December the 1st, 1955, and what it might cost her. She'd been thinking about resistance for years. She had tried to register to vote multiple times before succeeding. She'd investigated a rape case involving a black woman years earlier, in a case that received almost no national attention because the victim, Reese Taylor, did not fit the image that the movement needed for public sympathy to coalesce. Parks had gone to Alabama to document what had happened to Taylor. Nobody sent a bus full of reporters. The Montgomery bus boycott that followed Parks's arrest lasted 381 days. It was sustained, logistically, by the Women's Political Council of Montgomery, an organisation of black professional women led by Joanne Robinson, who had actually been planning a bus boycott for months before Parks's arrest, and who printed and distributed 50,000 flyers the night after Parks was arrested, working through the night on mimeograph machines, organising the infrastructure of the protest before most of the male leadership had finished their first meeting about it. Robinson's name does not appear in most accounts of the boycott at the level her contribution warranted. This is a pattern, not an exception. The women who came before and alongside Rosa Parks were not footnotes. They were the movement, doing the work that made the visible moments possible, choosing their risks deliberately, absorbing the costs quietly, and building something that the world would eventually have to reckon with. There is a concept that scholars would later call the double bind, and black women in 1950s America lived inside it every single day, without needing the academic terminology to know exactly what it felt like. You were simultaneously subject to the diminishment of your race and the diminishment of your gender, and these two forces did not simply add together. They interacted, multiplied, and produced something uniquely exhausting. The feminist movement of the era was not particularly interested in your specific experience. The civil rights movement, while fighting for your community, was often led by men who expected women to staff the phones, organise the marches, and then step back from the podium. The mainstream feminist conversations of the 1950s, to the extent that they were happening publicly at all in this decade, mostly in the magazines and women's clubs of middle-class white America, were organised around a set of concerns that were real but partial. The trap of the suburban housewife, the waste of women's intelligence in purely domestic roles, the condescension of a professional world that treated women as temporary workers waiting to become wives. These were genuine grievances. They described a genuine constriction, but they described the constriction as though it affected all women equally, which required not noticing or deciding not to mention that black women had never been offered the pedestal they were now being encouraged to climb down from. The problem with the feminine mystique, as it was being articulated, was that it assumed a domestic comfort that black women had never been permitted to occupy. Within the civil rights movement itself, the double bind took a different shape. The movement needed women, needed their organisational capacity, their community relationships, their willingness to absorb risk, their labour in every form. It also tended to position men as its public face and its decision-making leadership, reflecting the gender norms of the broader society it was fighting to change. Women like Ella Baker, who ran the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's operations and later helped found the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and who was perhaps the single most important organisational mind in the movement, found themselves consistently passed over for the leadership roles their competence had earned, in favour of men whose names are now more famous than hers. Baker was not alone, and she was not silent about it. She organised anyway, because the work mattered more than the credit, and because she had a clarity about what she was doing and why that did not require external validation. This is a characteristic you recognise. You have been practising this particular form of clarity your entire adult life, doing the work because it needs to be done, not because someone handed you a title and a podium. The title would have been nice, the podium would have been useful, but you learned early that waiting for permission was a luxury that the urgency of the work could not afford. The double bind meant that your specific experience, black, female, navigating both race and gender simultaneously, was not fully represented by either of the movements that claimed, in different ways, to speak for you. You were expected to choose, or to wait, or to be patient while the movement that was most urgently yours dealt with the more pressing issue first, which was always the issue that affected the men at the table most directly. You did not always wait. Sometimes you simply built your own table. The women who did that in this decade, who organised their own institutions, ran their own campaigns, defined their own terms, are among the most important architects of the world that came after. They just rarely got the credit for it in real time. For black families in 1950s America, education was not a preference or an aspiration. It was a survival strategy, pursued with the urgency of people who understood exactly what illiteracy had historically cost their community and what literacy might, if everything went right, eventually purchase. Black mothers pushed their children towards school with an intensity that the outside world sometimes found startling. They sacrificed comforts to buy books. They drilled spelling words at the kitchen table after working 12-hour days. They attended school board meetings and parent-teacher conferences as acts of advocacy, knowing that the schools their children attended were materially inferior to the schools on the other side of the line. The stakes were not abstract. You had watched what happened to people who didn't have the credential, who couldn't read the contract before they signed it, who couldn't write the letter to the landlord in language that the landlord would take seriously. Education was the difference between being vulnerable to exploitation in an obvious and daily way and being vulnerable to it in a more sophisticated and slightly less frequent one. It was not a guarantee of safety or dignity. The world around you made sure of that, with its red-lined maps and its ceilinged careers, but it was the closest thing to a tool for self-defense that could be acquired without a fight. The Brown versus Board of Education decision came down in May of 1954, and the reaction in black communities was one of the most complex emotional responses in American history. There was joy, real and immediate. The Supreme Court had looked at the architecture of segregation and called it what it was: unequal, not separate and equal, just unequal. For people who had been told for generations that the inequality was acceptable, that it reflected natural difference, that the separate schools were in fact equal if you just looked at them right, to have the Supreme Court say clearly that this was a lie, was not nothing. It was enormous. And then came the resistance, the White Citizens' Councils, the Southern Manifesto signed by 101 members of Congress, the school closures in Virginia, where entire counties shut down their public school systems rather than integrate them, leaving black children, and eventually unintentionally white children too, without schools for years. The violence directed at the first black children to enter white schools, small children, walking through crowds of screaming adults, escorted by federal marshals. You watched this happen and you understood, with a weariness that was also a kind of fury, that this country's commitment to its own stated principles had a very clear hierarchy of priority. You sent your children to school anyway. You enrolled them in the newly integrated schools when the option appeared, and you prepared them for what they would encounter there, not with warnings that would frighten them into paralysis, but with the particular combination of realism and confidence that you had been calibrating their whole lives. You told them, you're going into a room where some people will not want you there, and you're going to be excellent anyway, not for them but for yourself, because excellence is the thing no one can take away from you once you have made it yours. You had told them variations of this since they were old enough to understand words. They knew it the way they knew their own names. There were towns in 1950s America, a great many towns, spread across the North, the Midwest, and the West as much as the South, where the rule was simple: if you were black, you didn't want to be there after dark. Sundown towns were municipalities that had, through some combination of official ordinance, real estate covenant, economic exclusion, and occasional vigilante enforcement, ensured that their populations were entirely or nearly entirely white. The signs were sometimes literal. Sometimes they were not signs at all but understanding. The kind of understanding communicated by the expression on a gas station attendant's face when he looked at your car and looked at the sky and suggested you might want to make your purchases quickly. You learned about sundown towns the way you learned about most dangers in this era, not from a government pamphlet or a public service announcement, but from other black people who had been there and come back and reported what they found. The information travelled through churches and beauty salons and family networks with the efficiency of a system that understood its own necessity. Someone's cousin had driven through Levittown. Someone's uncle had taken a wrong turn in Cicero, Illinois. The stories were not always dramatic. Sometimes they were simply accounts of a town where every face that looked at you communicated, with perfect clarity, that your presence was being tolerated for the duration of your transaction, and not a moment longer. Sometimes the stories were worse than that. The geography of sundown towns covered enormous swaths of the country that white Americans thought of as the tolerant North. Researchers who would later map them found thousands, not dozens, thousands, of municipalities across Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Oregon, and every other state that had never posted a sign saying colored and white. The absence of signs had been interpreted by people who preferred not to look too carefully as evidence of a different kind of society. What it was actually evidence of was a society that had learned to maintain the same exclusions through different mechanisms, through zoning laws that prohibited multifamily housing, through real estate practices that kept black buyers out, through social enforcement that didn't need to be written down because everyone already understood the terms. Driving through sundown territory required the Green Book and something more than the Green Book, a constant low-level vigilance about time of day, about the fuel gauge, about whether you had enough of everything to get through to the next safe stop without needing to pull over. You did not speed. You did not give a bored small-town police officer a reason to pull you over, because a traffic stop in the wrong town at the wrong hour was not a traffic stop in any sense you could afford. You kept the car maintained, because a breakdown was not just an inconvenience, it was a situation, and situations in sundown towns had a way of escalating in directions that had nothing to do with your broken radiator. The psychological weight of this vigilance is difficult to convey to someone who has never experienced its equivalent. It is the weight of moving through space that has been designated as not yours, of being continuously aware that your presence is conditional, that the welcome is provisional and can be revoked without notice by anyone who decides the sight of you is more than they feel like tolerating today. You did not show this weight on your face. Showing it would have accomplished nothing and might have made things worse. You drove through, you completed your business, you kept your eyes moving and your expression neutral, and when you crossed back into safe territory, you breathed in a way you hadn't been breathing for the last 2 hours. You did this so routinely that you stopped noticing the breathing, you just drove. Among the occupational cultures that shaped black life in mid-century America, few were more structured, more respected, or more quietly influential than the world of the Pullman porter, the brotherhood of sleeping car porters, organized by A. Philip Randolph in the 1920s, had become by the 1950s one of the most powerful black labor unions in the country. The men who worked the rails were away for long stretches, which meant their wives managed everything at home, not just the children and the household, but the family finances, the community relationships, the social calendar, and often some form of additional employment. These women built a particular kind of competence that was total and uncelebrated. Your husband left on Sunday and returned on Thursday, or he left on Monday and returned when the route was done, and in between those departures and arrivals you were the entire operation. You paid the bills in the order that kept the most important things intact, the rent first, then the utilities, then the groceries, then the small amount set aside for the children's school needs, and the church envelope and the emergency fund that you maintained in a coffee tin behind the flour. Because the bank account was a more theoretical kind of money than the coffee tin, you had learned the difference between money you could see and money that existed on paper, and you managed both with the precision of someone who understood exactly what happened when the numbers didn't work out. The Porter households produced, at a rate that sociologists would later find remarkable, children who went to college. This was not accidental. It was the result of a specific set of conditions that the porter's income and the porter's wife's management created together. The union had negotiated wages that, while not lavish, were stable and came with benefits. a relative rarity in black employment in this era. Stability allowed planning. Planning allowed savings. Savings, carefully maintained by women who treated the coffee tin with the seriousness of an endowment, allowed the accumulation of enough to send a child to Howard or Spelman or Fisk, where they would acquire the credential that would open the next set of doors. The path was not short or easy. It was, however, a path, and it was built by women who managed households with executive precision, while their husbands worked the night trains north. The Porters brought things home from their roots besides wages. They brought newspapers from Chicago and New York, the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, publications that were not available in many southern towns, and that travelled the rail network in the Porters' bags, distributed to black communities along every route. They brought information about what was happening in other cities, about what other black communities were doing and building and demanding. Their wives received this information and moved it through the community networks they maintained, the church groups and civic organizations and neighborhood associations that were the connective tissue of black social life. When your husband was home, the household reorganized around his presence and then reorganized again when he left. You managed this transition with the smooth efficiency of someone who had done it enough times that the adjustment had become automatic. You did not resent his absences, or if you did, you had made your peace with them, because the income they represented was the foundation everything else was built on. You built a life on a foundation that was present only half the time, and you made it sturdy anyway, because that is what the situation required, and because you were not the kind of woman who built things that fell down. Light-skinned black women in 1950s, America occasionally faced a choice, one they did not ask for, one that came loaded with moral weight and practical consequence, about whether to allow the white world to mistake them for white. Passing was not new. It had existed as long as racial categories had been enforced in America, which is to say a very long time. But in the 50s, with its rigid social architecture, its documented paper trails, and its particular brand of paranoia about racial mixing, the decision to pass or not to pass carried its own specific texture. Some women passed to access jobs that were closed to black applicants, doing it quietly and with tremendous anxiety. Others refused on principle, even when they could have walked through the door undetected. The logistics of sustained passing were, if you think about them carefully, staggering. You could not mention your mother. You could not bring your family to the company picnic. You could not live in your own neighborhood without risking that a coworker would drive past and see where you went home to. You could not relax in the way that people relax when they are not performing a continuous, high-stakes identity. Every casual conversation was a navigation exercise. Every question about your background required a prepared answer. Every moment of genuine connection with a white colleague was shadowed by the knowledge that the connection was built on a foundation that could not bear the weight of the truth. And then there was the community you had left behind, or partially left behind, or were pretending not to belong to. Some women who passed lived in a kind of suspended social state, not fully present in white spaces because the passing required too much concealment, and not fully present in black spaces because the passing required too much distance. The isolation this produced was its own cost, one that was entirely invisible to the people around you in both worlds. You were everywhere and nowhere at once. You were whoever the situation required and not quite anyone at all. The women who refused to pass when they could have were making a statement that the world around them did not always interpret as the principled stand it was. To the white world, their refusal was invisible. It simply registered as a black woman in a black woman's place in the social order. To some members of the black community, a light-skinned woman who insisted on her blackness in contexts where she might have escaped it was doing something that read as either courageous or foolish, depending on who was watching and what it had cost them personally to occupy that particular place in the hierarchy of colour that existed, painfully and honestly, within black communities as well as between them. The politics of skin colour within black America in this era were real and complicated, and produced their own hierarchies and their own wounds. Lighter skin had historically conferred advantages within segregated black institutions, access to certain social circles, preference in certain hiring decisions made by black employers who had internalised the colour preferences of the broader culture. These advantages were real, and they were resented, and they were discussed with a frankness behind closed doors that was rarely replicated in public. You knew where you stood in this system, whatever shade you were. You knew what it had cost people above you and below you in it. You carried that knowledge quietly, the way you carried most of the complicated things, and you kept moving. Madam C.J. Walker had died in 1919, but her legacy was very much alive in 1950, walking around in the form of the black-owned beauty businesses that had proliferated in her wake. The beauty industry was one of the few economic sectors where black women could build real enterprises, not because white America was particularly welcoming, but because black women needed products designed for black hair, and the mainstream market showed no interest in providing them. This created an opening, and black women of extraordinary capability moved through it. The beauty shop was both a business and an institution, and the women who owned them were employers, community anchors, and de facto social workers in addition to being entrepreneurs. Opening a beauty shop required capital that most black women did not have in a lump sum, which meant it required the kind of creative financing that characterized black entrepreneurship in this era. The rotating credit associations, the family loans, the church community that sometimes backed a promising member's business venture as an act of collective investment in the neighbourhood's economic health. You saved for years. You found a space in a building where the landlord was willing to rent to you, which was itself a negotiation. You bought your equipment second-hand and refurbished it. You learned the business not from a business school, those were largely closed to you, but from the women who had done it before you, who passed on knowledge the way all essential knowledge moved in black communities, person to person, relationship to relationship, in the beauty shops and church halls where the actual education happened. The black-owned business district that existed in most mid-sized black communities in this era was, depending on your perspective, either a testament to black resilience and ingenuity, or a monument to the exclusion that made it necessary. Both were true. Sweet Auburn in Atlanta, Greenwood in Tulsa, which had been destroyed in the massacre of 1921 and was slowly rebuilding, the Farish Street district in Jackson. These were not second-tier commercial spaces, they were thriving, sophisticated economic ecosystems, with their own banks and insurance companies and newspapers and department stores and beauty colleges and funeral homes. They were built because the alternative was exclusion, and they were magnificent despite and because of that fact. The beauty college was a particular institution worth lingering on. Black cosmetology schools trained thousands of women in a profession that was genuinely open to them, that offered a real path to self-employment, and that carried genuine social status in the community. A licensed cosmetologist with her own shop was not simply a businesswoman. She was a person of standing, a community figure whose shop was a gathering place and whose opinion carried weight. Walker's company had pioneered a sales agent model that allowed black women to earn income selling beauty products door to door, building their own small businesses within a larger structure. By 1950, the descendants of this model were everywhere. Women running small beauty operations out their homes, supplementing incomes, building client relationships, creating the microeconomies that held neighborhoods together. The entrepreneurship was never free from the constraints of the larger system. Black businesses operated in red-lined neighborhoods with restricted access to capital, serving communities whose spending power had been deliberately limited by the same policies that confined them. The economic ecosystem was real and vital, and it was also bounded, hemmed in on every side by a structure that ensured the wealth accumulating within it could not easily move beyond it. You built anyway. You built because it was the thing available to build, and because building, even within constraints, produced something real. The shop with your name above the door, the employees you paid on Friday, the customers who came back every week because you were good at what you did and because the room you had made felt like home. There is a particular loneliness that belongs to the person who has made themselves so capable, so composed, so relentlessly excellent that the people around them stop seeing them as someone who might be tired. Black women in 1950s. America had been cultivating this kind of excellence for generations, not out of choice, exactly, but out of necessity. The expectation was total and unspoken. You would be excellent. You would be composed. You would handle it. You would manage, organize, endure, support, and produce without complaint. Because complaint was a luxury unavailable to people whose right to occupy space was still, in this country, a matter of active political debate. The loneliness was structural. It was produced by a specific set of conditions, being the only one in certain rooms, carrying knowledge that other people in those rooms did not have and had not had to acquire, performing a continuous composure that was necessary for survival, but that prevented the kinds of vulnerability through which connection is usually built. You could not afford to fall apart in most of the spaces you inhabited. You could not afford to be visibly struggling in the workplace, because struggling black women were not given the grace that struggling white women sometimes received. They were given confirmation of a narrative that had been waiting for evidence. So you did not give it evidence. You performed competence continuously and completely, and the performance was so good that people forgot it was costing you something. The strong black woman was not a myth. She was real, built by real women under real pressure, and she was genuinely strong. The myth was the part that said the strength was effortless. The myth was the part that made the strength seem like a natural characteristic, rather than an achievement produced by extraordinary and continuous effort. You were strong the way a bridge is strong, because the engineering was good, and the materials were sound, and because you had been built to hold weight. But bridges require maintenance, and the maintenance of a person who is expected to be perpetually strong is a thing that this era was not particularly organized to provide. The support systems that existed were real and important. The church, the community, the friendships between women who understood each other's lives from the inside. But even within these systems, the expectation of composure persisted. The women who gathered in the beauty salon and the church basement and on each other's porches were not simply resting, they were also performing, for each other, the version of themselves that the community needed to see in order to maintain its own confidence in its own capacity to survive. Grief and exhaustion were present. They were also managed because someone was always watching and drawing conclusions, and the conclusions drawn from a black woman's exhaustion in 1950s America were rarely sympathetic. What this produced, over time, was a loneliness that was invisible from the outside precisely because you were surrounded by people who needed you. The mother who needed you, the children who needed you, the community that needed you, the movement that needed you. Everyone needed you to be strong, which meant no one was particularly organized to notice whether you had anything left. You noticed. You managed it in the private hours, the early morning before the family woke, the late night after the house went quiet, with whatever internal resources remained. Some days the resources were ample. Some days you were operating on something closer to stubbornness than strength, and you called it strength because that was the word the moment required, and you kept going because stopping had never been presented to you as an available option. Blues, gospel, jazz, R&B beginning its slow emergence into the mainstream. The music of 1950s, Black America, was not incidental to its survival, it was structural. a way of holding the weight of the era in a form that the body could carry. Black women were at the centre of it, as performers, as audiences, as the keepers of a tradition that encoded grief and resilience and defiance and humour into 3-minute songs. Bessie Smith was already a ghost by then, but her influence moved through every woman who stood at a microphone in a church or a juke joint or a nightclub and opened her mouth and told the truth. The church choir was where most black women first learned what music could do, not as entertainment, not as performance in the theatrical sense, but as a technology for moving something through the body that the body couldn't hold alone. You sang because the alternative was carrying the week's accumulated weight in silence, and silence was not sufficient for what the week had contained. You sang with women who had worked in the same houses and ridden the same buses and managed the same impossible calculations, and the harmonies you made together were something that no individual voice could produce alone, something that required exactly this combination of exactly these people in exactly this room, and that justified the room's existence by itself. Outside the church, the music was doing something else. The blues, which white critics would spend decades trying to categorize and explain, was doing the thing it had always done, telling the specific truth about specific experience in language that was direct enough to be useful. Bessie Smith and her generation had established a tradition of black female vocal authority that was total and uncompromising. These were women who sang about desire and loss and anger and resilience without apologizing for any of it, who occupied the space of their own experience with a completeness that the broader culture was simultaneously attracted to and threatened by. By the 1950s, that tradition was moving into new forms. Sister Rosetta Tharpe was playing electric guitar with a ferocity and technical mastery that would directly influence rock and roll, a fact that the history books would take several decades to fully acknowledge. Dinah Washington was singing jazz and blues and early R&B with a voice that contained, in its particular combination of tenderness and iron, the exact emotional register of the era she inhabited. Sarah Vaughan was doing something with pitch and phrasing that made musicians stop what they were doing and listen. These women were not background figures or supporting characters. They were the thing itself, the originators, the innovators, the people whose artistic decisions shaped a cultural form that would eventually travel around the world and become one of the defining sounds of the 20th century. And underneath the famous names were the uncounted thousands, the women in the church choirs and the juke joints and the house parties and the small clubs in black neighbourhoods in every city, who participated in the tradition without being recorded by it, who sang because the music was necessary, and because they had something to put into it, and because the thing that came back out when they sang was worth the standing up and opening the mouth. The music held things together that had no other container. It named experiences that had no other language. It moved grief through the body and left something that wasn't quite joy but was adjacent to it, something more like confirmed survival, the emotional equivalent of still being here, which in 1950s Black America was not a small thing to be. Black communities in 1950s America were dense with social accountability in ways that could be simultaneously protective and suffocating. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone's business was, to some degree, everyone's business. This was not gossip for its own sake, though there was certainly that too, but a surveillance network developed over generations of necessity. When the broader society offered you no legal protection, the community had to protect itself, which meant keeping track of who was struggling, who was in trouble, who needed food, whose husband had not come home, whose child was running with the wrong people. You knew the names of every child on your block. Not because you had made a project of learning them, but because they existed in your field of awareness the way weather exists in a farmer's awareness, as information that was perpetually relevant to decisions you might have to make quickly. If one of those children was behaving in a way that suggested trouble brewing, you said something. not to embarrass the family, though embarrassment was sometimes the mechanism, but because the stakes of not saying something were higher than the social awkwardness of saying it. A child getting into the wrong situation on the wrong night in 1950s, America did not have the same margin for error as a child in a neighbourhood where the police could be called and trusted to help rather than escalate. The information network was primarily run by women. Men participated in it, but the architecture of it, the relationships of trust and regular contact through which information flowed, was largely built and maintained by the women who went to the same church, used the same beauty salon, attended the same community meetings, sat on the same front porches in the summer evenings when the heat inside the house was more than could be managed. The network was not formal. It had no organizational chart or meeting schedule. It was simply the accumulation of relationships between people who saw each other constantly and talked, while they were seeing each other and remembered what they were told. The accountability the network produced was real and not always gentle. Black communities in this era had strong norms about behaviour and presentation, enforced with the directness of people who understood that the whole community was judged by the behaviour of any of its members in the white world's eye. If your children were loud on the bus, it reflected on the community. If your house was not maintained, it reflected on the community. If you carried yourself in a way that gave the broader culture ammunition for its narratives, the community felt entitled to have an opinion about that, and the opinion would reach you through channels that were efficient and specific and left very little ambiguity about where it was coming from. This was not entirely comfortable to live inside. The scrutiny that protected also constrained. The network that kept children safe also kept adults accountable in ways that occasionally had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with social conformity. The black woman who did not attend church, or who kept unconventional hours, or who expressed opinions that the community found disruptive, she felt the network's other edge. But most women in most neighbourhoods, most of the time, experienced the density of social connection primarily as a form of support. The casserole that appeared when there was a death, the neighbour who picked up the children without being asked when work ran late, the community that showed up in the small and large moments, because it had developed over generations of necessity, the reflex of showing up. You lived inside it, and you maintained it, and on the days when it turned its attention toward you with warmth, you were profoundly grateful for it. Before Rosa Parks, before Martin Luther King Jr., before the nationally televised marches that most Americans know from their history textbooks, there were women doing the unglamorous essential work of building an infrastructure for civil rights. Fannie Lou Hamer, Septima Clark, Ella Baker, Daisy Bates. Women who organised voter registration drives in counties where attempting to register could get you evicted from your farm. Women who ran citizenship schools in church basements, teaching adults to read so they could pass the literacy tests designed specifically to exclude them. Women who wrote the letters, made the phone calls, knocked on the doors, and kept the machinery of the movement running while the men gave the speeches. Septima Clark ran citizenship schools on Johns Island, South Carolina, starting in the late 1950s, and the model she developed. Teaching literacy as a pathway to political participation, meeting people where they were rather than where the institution wanted them to be, was replicated across the South with results that were quiet and durable and transformative. Clark understood something about adult education and about dignity that the formal educational system had never quite grasped, that the person sitting across from you was not a vessel to be filled, but a human being with existing knowledge and capacity who needed specific tools, not instruction in how to be a competent adult. She treated people accordingly. They learned, they registered, they voted. The Highlander Folk School trained her, and she trained hundreds of others, and the network expanded outward from those church basements with the unhurried persistence of a root system. Daisy Bates ran the Arkansas State Press with her husband Lucius and was the central figure in the Little Rock school integration crisis of 1957. The woman who prepared, supported and accompanied the Little Rock Nine through the white crowds and the National Guard and the relentless social violence of being the first black children to walk into Central High School. The photographs show children. The history focuses on the children, appropriately. What is less frequently foregrounded is the adult woman who organised the logistics of their safe passage, who managed the fear and the preparation and the media and the community response, and who received death threats continuously throughout the process and continued anyway. Ella Baker's contribution to the civil rights movement is perhaps the hardest to capture in a single paragraph, because it operated at a level of organisational depth that resists the kind of narrative compression that produces memorable sentences. She was not a charismatic public speaker in the mode the movement lionised. She was something rarer and arguably more valuable. A person who understood how to build organisations that could sustain themselves, how to develop leadership rather than concentrating it, how to construct a movement that would outlast any single figure. She founded the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee specifically as a counter to the top-down leadership model of the SCLC, specifically because she believed that young people should lead themselves rather than be led by their elders. She was right. The results were extraordinary. Her name is not as widely known as it should be, which is a fact about history and not about her. You were not Ella Baker or Septima Clark or Daisy Bates, most likely. But you were in the room when the meeting happened. You made the phone calls when the phone tree was activated. You drove the people who needed driving and fed the people who needed feeding, and kept the children of the people who needed to be somewhere else. The movement ran on your labour as surely as it ran on the speeches, and the speeches would not have been possible without the labour. This is not a consolation prize. It is an accurate accounting of how change actually happens. Respectability politics is a phrase that carries some baggage today, and not without reason. But in 1950s, America, the philosophy that black advancement required impeccable public presentation, was not a form of self-hatred. It was a calculated survival strategy developed by people who had studied very carefully how white America made its decisions. The National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, the Links, the Jack and Jill of America. These organizations, built and run by black women, operated on the principle that dignity was a form of argument, and that the best way to dismantle the stereotype was to present its precise opposite, consistently, publicly, and without apology. The NACW's motto was "Lifting as we climb," and the slogan was chosen with precision. It acknowledged without illusion that some black women had climbed higher than others, that class and education and skin colour and geography had produced a hierarchy within black America as real as the hierarchy imposed on black America from outside. And it insisted, in the same breath, that the obligation of those who had climbed was not to distance themselves from those who hadn't, but to reach back. This was not simply altruism, it was strategy. In a society that evaluated the entire race by the behaviour of any of its members, the behaviour of all its members was a collective concern. The organisations were social and civic and deeply serious about both dimensions. A Links chapter meeting was not frivolous. It was a gathering of educated, accomplished women who were also running fundraisers for community programmes, advocating at the local government level, mentoring younger women, and building the professional and social networks that supported black advancement in their cities. The social component, the teas and the cotillions and the formal dinners was not the point. It was the container for the point, which was the development and maintenance of a community infrastructure that the broader society was not going to provide. The cotillion was a particular institution, the formal debut of young women into society, that existed in black communities across the country as a statement of something the white world preferred not to acknowledge. That black families had daughters who deserved ceremony, who merited the ritual marking of their entrance into adult womanhood, who were entitled to the same acknowledgement of their worth and promise that white debutante culture offered to white girls. The cotillion gowns were white. The venues were the best available. The girls were coached in deportment and presented with a seriousness of purpose that was partly about social tradition and entirely about insisting, in the most formal possible language, that these young women mattered. The limitations of the respectability framework were real and would be argued over with increasing intensity as the decade progressed and the civil rights movement's more confrontational strategies began to produce results that respectability alone had not managed to generate. The critique that the framework placed the burden of racism's solution on its victims, that it demanded black people be better in order to be treated as equal rather than demanding that equality be extended regardless, was valid and important. But the women who built these organizations in the 1950s were not naive about this. They were operating in the tools available to them, in the conditions that existed, with the goal of building something that would survive them. They were building institutions that would still be standing when other strategies became possible, and they were in the meantime providing real support to real people in real circumstances, which was not nothing. It was in fact the whole point. Despite everything, the segregation, the poverty engineered by policy, the daily navigation of a country that regarded them as secondary at best, black women in 1950s, America built things. They built families that produced engineers, doctors, judges, and presidents. They built churches that anchored communities for generations. They built businesses that created employment and wealth in neighborhoods that the mainstream economy had formerly abandoned. They built a culture in music, in food, in language, in fashion, in faith, so vital and so generative that the rest of America would spend the following decades quietly borrowing from it, repackaging it, and occasionally acknowledging where it came from. The building happened in the margins of days that were already full. It happened in the hours between the end of the paid workday and the beginning of sleep, in the community meetings that ran long and the church committees that met on Tuesday evenings and the kitchen tables where plans were made over coffee and exhaustion. It happened in the beauty salon decisions to expand into a second chair and the savings accumulated in coffee tins and the school fees paid in installments and the letters written to legislators who rarely wrote back. None of it was dramatic. All of it was essential. The families were built with the deliberateness that the mythology of family tends to obscure, the mythology preferring the idea that families simply happen, the product of love and biology and the natural order of things. The families that black women built in 1950s America were not simply the product of love and biology. They were strategic constructions, built with clear intent towards specific outcomes, maintained through effort that did not stop when it was inconvenient, oriented always toward the question of what the children would be able to do and be that their mothers had not been permitted to do and be. The investment in children in these households was total and serious, and produced results that the surrounding system did its best to prevent, and that happened anyway. The culture they built has been one of the most consequential aesthetic forces in modern history. The food, the specific genius of black American cooking, its capacity to produce magnificence from scarcity, to turn the discarded cuts and the overlooked ingredients into something that people would travel to eat, came from kitchens managed by black women who were working within severe constraints and exceeding them daily. The music came from the same tradition, the same capacity to make beauty out of the materials at hand, which were sometimes the voice alone and the body alone and the gathered voices of other people in the same room. The language, the vernacular innovations that have travelled so far from their origin that most of the people using them have no idea where they came from communities where creativity was not a luxury, but a survival tool, a way of communicating with precision and wit and layers of meaning in spaces where direct speech was sometimes dangerous. What they built is still here, not in the form of monuments with their names on them. The monuments are still catching up, still being argued over, still being erected by people who are only now arriving at the acknowledgement that was overdue from the beginning, but in the form of institutions that are still functioning, families that are still building, a culture that is still moving through the world, still being made, still insisting on its own vitality and worth. The women who made it possible did not always get to see the results. They built toward a future they could feel, but not yet touch, and they built it with the full force of everything they had, in the margins of days that should by rights have left nothing over for building. That they did it anyway is not a footnote, it is the whole story. And so here you are, still breathing, still warm, still on the right side of a ceiling that nobody had to fight to let you through tonight. You have spent the last few hours in 1950s America, and if you were paying attention, really paying attention, you felt something settle into your chest that is heavier than tiredness and more complicated than sadness. It is the weight of a story that deserves to be carried carefully. The story of women who woke before sunrise and dressed themselves like armour and rode buses to houses that weren't theirs and came home and did it all again, not because the world had arranged itself generously around their needs, but because they had decided somewhere deep and unshakable that their lives and their children's lives were worth the effort. And they were right. Think about what they did with what they had. They built churches from community savings and ran freedom schools in the basements. They maintained households on wages that required mathematics to survive. They raised children for a future they were not entirely sure they would live to see, and they told those children every morning in 100 different languages of love and preparation that they were worthy of that future, that the world's opinion of them was not the final word and never would be. They organised movements that changed laws. They sang music that changed the world. They kept the lights on in communities that the rest of the country had decided to leave in the dark. They were not perfect. They were human, complicated and tired and occasionally petty and sometimes wrong, and always, always doing the best they could inside conditions that were not of their making and were not fair and were not going to apologise for themselves. Perfection was never the point. Endurance was the point. Building was the point. Loving their people well enough and fiercely enough to pass something forward through the darkness into hands that could carry it further. That was the point. So tonight, as you pull your blanket up in your warm room, in your safe bed in a world that is imperfect and unfinished, but is also in crucial ways the result of everything those women refused to stop building, maybe take a moment, not a grand moment, just a quiet one, a breath of acknowledgement for the women whose names you don't know and whose labour made things possible that you have never had to fight for the women who are magnificent under conditions designed to make magnificence impossible. They did not get enough rest. Let that thought accompany you into yours. Sleep well.